Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thang, Earthlets, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, as always, Malchar, and on this episode, well, autumn has arrived, let's face it, over the course of like half an hour. So it's time to think about, the nights are drawing in, the weather's bad, let's hunker down with a nice scary read, and in particular the Misty Scream special, which is out now and will be on shelves throughout October. Perfect read for this time of year, or perfect gift if you want to give somebody a nice horror anthology. And on this episode, I talk to Kristyna Baczynski, Cavan Scott, Maura McHugh, and Alec Worley, who are all writers on the new special. And we have a really good chat about not just the special itself, but also horror comics, what horror works in comics, why horror can work in comics, what makes us scared, one or two personal revelations in there. So it was great to be able to chat to them. We then move on to talking with Claire Napier, who is a comic critic of note, has worked at Women Write About Comics, and I talked to her about Savage and Invasion, which is the Pat Mills, Jerry Findlay Day, Jesus Blasco, and then Charlie Adlard and Patrick Goddard series when it became Savage. And that's a really interesting chat because Claire is not somebody who's necessarily massively versed in 2000 AD lore, so she's coming to stuff fresh. It was really interesting what she thinks about the difference between Invasion and Savage, how they work, why they work, where they don't work. Another deep dive from the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. As always, hope you're staying safe. Scary times out there, let's not talk about them. This is a nice safe space for everybody to just enjoy comics and talk about comics and horror comics and scary comics. Let's crack on and talk to Kristyna, Cavan, Maura, and Alec about the Misty Scream special. So we're talking about the Misty Scream special, and we're joined by the Aegis writer, Kristyna Baczynski.
Hi.
Hi. The Dracula File writer, Cavan Scott.
Hello there.
Black Beth writer, Alec Worley.
Hello.
And Thief of Senses writer, Maura McHugh.
Hello.
Right, we're all here. Excellent. Good. So, Halloween, how is it almost upon us already again? This year seems to feel like it's been a million years long and also 2 days.
Yeah.
I want to touch on individual stories, but also talk more generally about horror in comics. So I think because Maura's strip is the first one in the Misty Scream special, I'm going to come to her first. Tell us a little bit about the Thief of Senses, because there's a wonderful Victorian feel. Well, it's set in the Victorian period, but there's a wonderful kind of sense of atmosphere to this one. Tell us a little bit about the strip without giving it away.
Yeah, it is. I've actually had an idea for this story for years, and so when it came up, the Misty special, I was like, yes. And when I was talking to Keith Richardson, the editor, I actually pitched it to him straight away because I had it in my mind, and he was like, go with that. So it's I love Victorian stories, and especially when you're going for ghost stories at this time of the year. So it's about a very small family, and the mother is a seamstress, and her daughter has notions of what she'd like to be. And it's a lot about, and there's a monster in it. So I like a good old monster. This isn't a ghost story, this is a monster story. And it's the idea of things that we I think cause problems in our lives. I mean, that's a kind of higher metaphorical thing, but it's an actual monster that's causing problems. And also it's to do with senses, or different types of senses, and what happens when some of them get removed. So that's it. I don't want to go too further into it, because I mean, all these stories are quite short, so it's very easy to spoil them.
Are there particular existing titles and influences that you were drawing on for something like this? Because certainly Thief of Senses and the Aegis are very much on the Misty end of the Scream Misty duality. So were you thinking about the kind of girls' comics that you got in the 70s and 80s or something like this?
Yeah, absolutely, because I actually, one of the things that's cool about the Misty series is they had things from lots of different time periods, and I actually always really liked that. So you get a nice mix of things, and it also was a way of showing you the kind of problems that girls, because it was always focused on girls, had in these different eras, and which are weirdly still prevalent sometimes today. So yeah, it was and also I wanted to think of a story where I didn't have to work, there wasn't going to be any cursing, or it's aimed at a young adult audience, and that was my audience. I wasn't thinking of an adult, you know what I mean? I was very much thinking that this is for teenage or slightly younger age.
And you've got the artist on the strip, Robin Henley, who was the winner of the Thought Bubble talent search competition. Was it last year? I think it may well have been. Yeah,
very recently. Yeah, very delighted. Really, I mean, but I love working with lots of different artists, and often you get matched by the editor, and actually I always think that's like a lucky dip surprise. It's like, yay. And actually I really enjoy that. I like and so it's nice when you know the artist, because you can kind of tailor your work towards them. Like when I was doing the with Paddy Goddard on the Dead Run, the Anderson, like I knew after about the second one what Paddy liked, and I was sort of, you start streamlining stuff. When you've got a multi-narrative story, you can do that. But when you don't know who the artist is going to always be, I try to be extremely clear and interesting and evocative, and hopefully they'll get with that. But Robin liked the strip, it's so good.
Kristyna, I want to move on to you, because you're the new face in this crowd on this call, because anyone who's read our specials in 2080 for a while will know Cavan and Alec and Maura. How did you come to be working on the Misty Scream special?
I was just invited to write. So I did a science fiction graphic novel, my first debut graphic novel, about 18 months before Oliver Pickles approached me. And then just asked me if I wanted to do a one-shot for 2000 AD. And luckily he couldn't see me visually getting the email and dancing. But I just tried to keep my cool on text and be like, wow, sounds great. Let me check if I'm free. So started writing. And there was very loose brief that he asked that it would be about the Aegis shield. So one particularly wanted a story that had some kind of historical context, but not necessarily set in like an ancient myth.
Because it's very much like I said, on the Misty end of the scale of this, but there's that wonderful mix of knowable elements like the Aegis and Medusa and whatnot, but with the genre mashup of it being a musical.
Yeah. I don't know how that came about. I was trying to get some kind of historical cues in it, and was coming up with lots of contexts where this kind of relic, this ancient relic, could have been found. So crusades or archaeologists, or like how could this thing surface in a modern context, time travel, sci-fi, like coming up with lots of ideas. But then I was kind of thinking about the young adult Misty stuff and what horror elements I like, which is like Carrie, The Craft, Ghost World kind of attitude, but with like kind of 70s, 80s, 90s like teen horror aesthetics, and tried to do a mashup of that. So I was like, how can I get characters like that into a story about this kind of powerful relic, and maybe have a story about Medusa in it somehow as well. So kind of came up with the idea of doing like a play within a play type thing, but it's a kitsch school musical within a 2000 AD comic.
And forgive me, I've not read your graphic novel. Is this in the same kind of genre as that, or was this something new to you?
This was quite new to me. I had a lot of fun writing this. So my graphic novel is Retrograde Orbit, and it was about it's a sci-fi story about growing up as a second generation child of immigrants. So my family are all from Ukraine, and I'm second generation English Ukrainian. But kind of unpacking that kind of social, cultural heritage, and how that kind of plays out in familial relationships. But instead of it being about countries and borders on one planet, it's set out on like planets in a solar system, and that's the kind of sci-fi element. But it's essentially that kind of story. So I guess it's quite character driven. I really like coming up with cool characters and enjoying writing dialogue, and I think there's a lot of that in the Aegis. Like I've had a lot of fun coming up with these broody, snarky, quite villainous and revenge lustful teenagers who somehow get their hands on an Aegis. Is it the real Aegis? Oh, you'll have to read it and find out.
You got nominated for an Eisner Award, I believe, a few years ago. And that was for best short. And I'm interested to know what your experience was of writing the kind of compressed storytelling for only a few pages that you get in something like this, especially, and how you found that process.
I was really overwhelmed at the thought of doing it because it was a one shot, but it was also a 24-hour comic challenge. So the challenge was at the Lakes Comics Festival, so I was invited as guest to do it, and then we sat for 24 hours in a room, and there was me, Warwick Johnson Cadwell, Dan Berry, Sarah McIntyre, Fumio Bata, Jack Teagle, and Joe Deasy, and we were all in a room together, all working on 24-page comics. So we were allowed to prepare beforehand, so I really leaned into the writing because I knew exactly the parameters of the drawing of the art. It's like a page an hour for 24 hours, and then you can collapse afterwards. But the drawing was very much, the writing was very much as I could prepare in advance. So I was like, you can write the story, you can figure it out, give yourself breaks, give yourself a page where you draw the same thing over and over again, and maybe change a slight background element. So I had to be quite ingenious within the parameters of the challenge. So instead of it being about a character, it was about an object. So it's an object biography traveling through time. So kind of, it's got history and sci-fi in it, which is kind of what we've just been talking about, which is great. So extremely in my wheelhouse. So yeah, it was very fun to write, knowing what I was briefing myself. Writing this story that Aegis was interesting. It's the first time I've ever written and not been the artist as well. So that was novel. But Mary Safro did an amazing job on the art. It was so exciting seeing it come in.
And it's one of the things that's always really nice with these specials is just seeing the range of artwork that goes on in them. And you look at something like Mary Safro has done with your strip, and although there are some similarities to what Robin has done with Maura's strip, they're in a very different style. It's not. There's no. I was about to say homogeneity. Can never quite say it properly to that. But I want to move on to talking to Cavan next, because his challenge was slightly different, because whereas Maura and Kristyna were doing news stories effectively, the Dracula File is one of those stories from Scream that has a lot of baggage with it. Let us put it that way. Not just the comic baggage, but the book. It's about Dracula. How did you find that? Was it a case of just seeing what had been done on the original strip and working out the formula, or doing your own thing with it?
Well, I was lucky in the way that it was my favourite strip when I read Scream back in the day. I collected Scream all the way through its short run. My parents hated it with a passion, like they hated most of my interests, so much so they banned it from the house after picking it up. So I had a friend who lived down the road who had a crawl space under his house, which we made into a den. So I used to take it under there, and we used to read Scream in 2000 AD and everything under there. It was only years later that I realised they're still there. He moved and I moved on, and I looked for my collection of Scream, and they're probably still mouldering under that house, or someone has found. And I'm going through and rebuying them all, which is far more expensive than the 22p they cost me back then. So I really
like the beginning of a Stephen King.
I know. Yeah, we never found any bodies under there, and we really looked. So yeah, when I was asked by Keith to follow up on Dracula Files, he gave me a pretty wide remit on it. I can do anything I wanted, but I wanted to lean into the legacy. For people who've not read Dracula Files, the story of it is basically Dracula in the 70s or the 80s is sent over to the UK from Russia. The Russians and the KGB especially are really happy about this because he will destroy the enemy for them. And one sole KGB agent, Stakis, has a conscience, and he decides he can't let that happen, and so sort of smuggles himself into Britain to try and find Dracula. And I loved Stakis because I always wondered what would happen if he was caught by anyone, because he's an illegal immigrant, he's a KGB officer, and oh yeah, I'm over here to hunt Dracula. I mean, yeah, obviously. So he always fascinated me, and of course the story had an open end. It never ended. You know, the series was cancelled before the series. Before Dracula Files came to an end. When it was picked up in the summer specials, it was just still Dracula was on the run and Stakis was still after him. And so I wanted to look at what would happen to Stakis now, and if he's still around, and where is he, and what kind of mental state is he in, and does anyone believe him? And so that was the beginning of the story. And I put it in thinking, they're never going to let me do this. And it was one of those wonderful moments when they did.
Because the original strip was so perfect. It was such for me, as somebody who came to it later, it was such an encapsulation of British comics in the 1970s and 80s. So parochial, you know, and contemporary with it as well. But playing with these bits of genre that kids probably half understood. So that they might have seen Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee in a horror film, and that's their understanding of that character. Yeah,
exactly. And it's influenced me so much. And it was only really when I was looking at doing this that I realised how much it's influenced me. I did an entire run on Doctor Who, which was gangsters and vampires and agents, and that pretty much was the Dracula Files, you know. And more recently, I launched a comic with Vault Comics in the States called Shadow Service, which is spies and monsters, and it's everything I keep coming back to. It's all got its source matter there in the Dracula Files. It was the first strip in the comic. It was, you know, and it was the one I went back to over and over again. And yeah, for a Hammer fan of that time, you know, you could quite easily see Christopher Lee carrying on playing the role in the pages. You know, it sort of dived into those later Hammer films where he turned up in the 70s. You know, it was definitely that kind of, you know, Stakis was a real man's man with big sideburns, and, you know, and he would have worn Brute, you know, and it was, you know, and the people he found were always sort of like archetypes you'd never find in the real world, but which were always in soap operas at the time. You know, it was Dracula meets Coronation Street meets the Sweeney. And for me at the time, and still to this day, that's a pretty good mix.
Yeah, you get strips like the Dracula File, you get strips like the 13th Floor and Doom Lord, and they're all drawn by these incredible artists who managed to do the one thing that, and we'll come on to talking about this in a minute, do the one thing that horror should always do, which is to make the familiar scary.
Yeah.
To place horror at the heart of what you assume to be safe. And the Dracula File managed to, I don't know, it's an incredible feat thinking about it, because it managed to be scary and funny and a bit ridiculous, but also deathly serious and quite gothic, but also contemporary. That's quite a tightrope to walk.
And also really quite gross without, you know, in a very sort of PG-13 way. I mean, it was when Dracula had his thralls, they were rotting away, and you could smell their breath. And so again, we tried to push it with the strip in the special this year, you know, and there were a few moments when we were going, Francesco does the art, so how much blood can we get in this? And I'm always with it, you know, when I was reading it as a kid, the worse 2000 AD and Scream got when it came to gore, the more I lapped it up. You know, it was definitely my wheelhouse, and it always has been. And so, yeah, we definitely tried to push it to the limit in this strip, while still keeping it within the realms of decency-ish.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you know, the Dracula File is was one of the most popular strips in Scream, because I want to talk to Alec next, who's got a very fitting Zoom background on, or is that not in your house?
I kind of wanted to put ugly monsters around me just because I need all the help I can get, so it just makes me look better. But
well, mate, in this context, you're looking very fresh-faced.
Thank you. Well preserved.
Because you've written Black Beth. Now, she's got quite well, I wouldn't say complicated, but a different kind of situation in terms of her original publication, really, wasn't she?
Yeah, she's got a really interesting backstory, and one that when I did the first strip in one of the previous Scream Misty Scream specials, I did a little bit of detective work into this. So I first read her in the 1988 Scream special, which came out like I think 4 years after Scream had finished. And most of it was taken up with just this amazing story called Black Beth, which was this kind of sword opera, Punisher meets, almost like Punisher meets Red Sonja meets Macbeth. It was really odd, but it had just this incredible artwork that looked just like the illustrations from Talisman of Death, the Fighting Fantasy game books I was into at the time, and I just became obsessed with this strip. I absolutely loved it, and I couldn't quite understand why it had turned up in Scream. And I would kind of draw my own pictures and make my own stories. And I found out that Beth came about in the early 70s for another proposed IPC book called Scream that was canned before it hit issue 1. And so the pages for Black Beth sat in a drawer for 10 years until they were exhumed by editors in 1988 who were looking for material to fill in the specials. And it was Blas Gallego who was the artist, and he was doing a lot of Hammer horror, the Hammer magazine from back in the day, adaptations for The Vampire Lovers and some other bits I can't remember, but I got in contact with Blas, and I got in touch with Des Skin, who edited Hammer at the time, to try and find out who wrote this, and no one knows who wrote it. It's lost in the mist of time. So having done a previous story with her, I kind of I guess kind of rebooted, because it was for a slightly different readership. Times have moved on. I wanted to focus it more on Beth, kind of take away the initial prologue from the original, which was, and talking with Danny as well about how we were going to design her up, and having a really specific idea of how much magic was in this world, because the initial story is quite kind of realistic and medieval. so yeah, with the one I got in this special, I wanted to, because the first story I did was quite kind of cramped and crowded and busy. I wanted this one to be quite kind of open, kind of almost like a open Spanish vistas, like filming locations for the spaghetti westerns and kind of Barbarian and Almeria. I think that was done. I remember sending Danny a load of reference pics of all the deserts there, and it's called The Witch Tree, and it's about Beth running afoul of a bunch of an angry mob who is out to lynch a witch. And again, I can't really say so much more than that because it's not a very long story, but yeah, so and Danny was just the perfect artist for it. She just, I mean, she hasn't got that kind of fineness that Gallego has, but it doesn't matter because this is her take, and it just feels grungy and gritty and grounded and realistic. And she was totally on board for kind of how we wanted to go about kind of redoing the character, because again, like Maura said, I kind of wrote this for a YA audience, not for 40-year-old dudes who may have read it in the first instance. So it was important to kind of see the world through her eyes, and I changed up her sidekick as well. So he's this kind of was talking to Danny, and we said, oh, he's got to be this hot dude with a six-pack and kind of a shirt open a lot of the time. But unfortunately, didn't see much of him in the first one. But yeah, so that was Beth. But yeah, she's always been a bit. I know as a kid, I could never quite understand why she turned up in that Scream special. I was like, this isn't Scream, because I was like Cavan. I read Scream was my 2000 AD, and my parents hated it, and my mum binned the whole lot the first chance she could, and I was heartbroken. And again, picking up old back issues on eBay. But yeah, so that's Beth.
So you two were much cooler than me as a kid. My big argument with my parents was over the first issue of the real Ghostbusters comic.
What was in the real Ghostbusters that was?
Oh, there was a fact file about. My parents are religious, and there's a fact file at the back about different types of ghosts, and they were just a bit alive to that. Anyway, definitely didn't scar me. But just talking about Danny's artwork, it's got this wonderful. For me, it's as great as the original artwork on Black Beth was. There's something wonderfully. Alex Toth, Frank Miller about
Smoky.
Yeah. Smoky and just dripping with that kind of 1970s, 1980s vibe. It's incredible.
Totally, yeah. I mean, we were talking about, we wanted to do something that was kind of going back even further to kind of creepy and eerie, because they used to run a lot of sword and sorcery stuff as well, and just to kind of capture that. I think what I didn't want in it was any kind of snark that you kind of get now. I wanted it to be completely living in that world and have the same kind of commitment to that world that those old stories had, but to set it in, place it with a heroine that kind of feels a bit more contemporary and a bit more modern and kind of switched on for a modern audience.
I think she's the character that actually bridges the gap, well, such as the line, shall we say, between Misty and Scream, because as you say, that there are kind of supernatural elements to it, but also there's that kind of slight actiony horror.
She feels totally like a Misty character. Yeah.
And how? I suppose you've already answered this. I was going to ask about how close you felt it was comfortable to tack to what the character was before, when there was so little of that character in print.
Well, I went through, because I knew the original strip really well, but what I did is I took kind of what I wanted, and I left behind what I felt needed to be left behind. So it's very similar to that. It's kind of that in the original strip, you've got that Cinderella motif of she's been wronged and beaten up, and her beloved has been taken away from her. So I was kind of like, yeah, just snip that off, and we'll just kind of I've got my own kind of idea of what's happened to her and what's set her off down this path. But we're not really going into that here. You just kind of wanted to, again, because the stories are so short, you haven't really got too much time to jump in and sort of start talking background. So it was just hit the ground running and bang, straight into an adventure. but yeah, I think just in terms of her mentality, you just kind of think it's the same mentality as the Punisher, and it's not a healthy one. And you know, she is kind of flawed, and Guido is kind of her moral compass, and it's interesting to explore that. I think just in it's again, you're doing what a lot of reboots and kind of retakes and stuff do, is that they do take they kind of question the it's like you were saying with Stakis. It's kind of like, well, what would he be doing now? Why would he be doing that? And kind of rationalizing it a little bit and kind of asking it, and that just comes up with new stories. And it's just like a classic way of revising these things, I think.
I want to throw this open to the floor, really, because I want to talk about horror in comics. Now, when we've talked about Misty Scream in the past on the podcast, you know, this is a question I've asked. I'm constantly fascinated by the way different writers approach this, because one of the main facets, one of the advantages of comic books as a medium is the ability of both the creators and the reader to control the flow of time. Mm-hmm. And when you think about horror, particularly audiovisual, movie and TV horror, it's so much about the control of time, you know, the jump scare, the building up of tension. So I'm curious as to what you all feel about how you approached horror in your own strips, and whether you moved, rejected the jump scare, moved towards it, how you build tension as a writer on a short, where you've got a lot of work to do in a short strip.
I think a great deal. Scott McCloud said that the story happens in the gutters, in the white spaces in between the panels. So one of the things I do a lot is thinking, what can I remove from the story? And allow the imagination of the reader to go into that. So you have to think very carefully about what is the image you want to retain. And I think what I love about horror, and actually I'm not a big fan of I'm a huge horror fan. I mean, that's actually my wheelhouse. That's my main bag. It's always been an obsession of mine since I was a kid. I think I don't like slash horror, which is very explicit and it's got blood flying, and it gives you, I actually much prefer stuff that's unsettling, uneasy, and gives you space to and it's ironic when you look at, I know it's not quite horror, but say Jaws, where the breaking of the machine, the shark, actually made them be more subtle in the use of the monster. And in Alien, the original Alien, you actually see very little of the alien, because I think he said that he didn't want it to look like a man in a suit. And you never want your monster to look fake, So yeah, that's what I think about a lot. And then your course really dependent on your artist. So I try to always give some sense of the emotion or the tenor. And it was nice because when I sent I wrote this in the, this crazy lockdown time we had, and it was super hot and really sunny when I wrote this sort of gothic piece. And I sent it to Keith, and he said, "Well done. I feel like," he says, "it's blazing hot outside, and I feel like I'm inside equivalent of a haunted house." So that was nice.
Kristyna, I wanted to ask you about your strip, because you name-checked films like Carrie earlier on, which is a very particular kind of horror. How did you feel about generating a sense of tension in your strip?
The Aegis is all about the build. It's kind of a teen revenge story, really. So it's just dropping crumbs the whole time, and as this play goes on and it reaches its final scene, the comic also reaches its final pages and final moments, and that's the kind of crux of the suspense being built. So the whole writing and kind of breaking it down into panels, which I did way more, because when I write for myself, I think I retain a lot in my head about, well, I know that I'm going to do that when I end up being the artist. So, but with this, because I was handing it over to an unknown artist at the time when I was writing it, I had to do way more panel breakdowns and think about layouts and kind of very lightly storyboard. I didn't want to like completely steamroll the art process, because it's got to be fun for the artist as well, but also wanted to break down the pages in terms of, right, this is a wide, this is a splash, like we need to see a lot here, or let's make this montagey and tight and kind of build tension. So it was fun to kind of get to do that as a writer rather than as an artist for the first time. But then, yeah, in terms of horror, like it's definitely kind of riffing on that kind of moment in Carrie, and in The Craft as well, that kind of the build of these teenagers should not have this much power. Oh no, something's going to go terribly wrong, maybe. Which was fun. But then at the time I was also reading horror comics, so I've been reading a lot of Junji Ito like this year. So I read Tomi for the first time, and it was just when you were talking about it before that I was like, that's kind of like an interesting thought about like how horror plays out differently in comics, which I hadn't really kind of put together before. But that's definitely more about being unsettling, like Maura was saying, rather than the jump scare, because you can't time it and you don't have an audio track and you don't have that like immediacy and momentum that cinema has. But you do have panels, speed, page turns, and kind of elements of size and immersion in comics, which you don't have in film. So there's that kind of element in Tomi that I was reading, which is these repetitions of unsettling scenarios. Like the more you get to know her, you jump to these different situations where she just keeps cropping up and you're like, oh, these suckers don't know. And then some genuinely disgusting like body horror happens, which is great. So there's that element of being able to kind of hold back and let things play out, and I guess your readers know as much as you let them know. So it's quite nice to let them have just crumbs enough, like in a short story. I think mine's 7 pages, you can't do it too much, but it's nice to put a few crumbs in there to pay off at the end. It'd be nice to do something again a little bit longer, but we'll see. 7 pages, I feel like a baby among these titans, but it's been fun.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting, because obviously with something like Dracula File, and I've only just noticed your T-shirt, Cavan.
Live in the brand.
What Kristyna was just saying about gore and things like that. With something like Dracula, a known brand, a known character, a known quantity. Is it tempting to just lean into that and just go for the kind of gross shocks?
It's always tempting, and I probably do it too much in my other work. But it's funny because I've ended up writing a lot of kids comics over the years, which is not what I aim to do at all, because I always wanted to write Fangoria inspired horror comics. But the thing is that, yeah, there is gore in the Dracula Files, because we wanted to lean into its original run so much. However, it's not really Dracula's story, it's the story of Stakis. And what I love about horror, and my favorite type of horror, is when you have very competent people who are out of control and can't do anything. I mean, Maura's got a poster for my favorite horror film of all time behind her, and in The Wicker Man, Edward Woodward character is one of the best cops in Scotland, and he can't get out of what's happened. And that's what we have in the Dracula Files. That Stakis at the time was, a top KGB agent, and he could never stop all this happening. He couldn't stop the bodies racking up. And so when I was thinking about how this would affect him. That's where the horror came from. So yeah, in the new strip, there is gore, there is blood, but there's also at the heart of it a terror of a man who's starting to think, was there ever a Dracula, or was it just me? And so I think that's where the horror comes from. And yeah, and the blood and the gore is fun, and it is, you know, as I say, it's that sort of like Hammer love letter to Hammer that's coming out in it. But yeah, the actual horror of the story isn't the gore. The horror of the story is a man who's on the very edge of his own sanity, not knowing what's real and what's not.
Alec, your strip is the only black and white one in this collection. I'm curious what you and everybody else thinks about black and white as and I'm merely repeating something that I read recently in a comment thread. I'm not endorsing it. I'm not saying it's right. That it is easier to do horror in black and white than it is in colour.
No, I think it's depends on the horror. There are so many different types of horror. I mean, you've got Carrie is different from Junji Ito. The Wicker Man is different from. There's so many different modes of horror. You know, you've kind of got the M.R. James quiet horror, then you've got David Cronenberg and Hellraiser, and I think it depends what effect you're going for. I mean, I really like the black and whiteness in Black Beth because it does give it that certain atmosphere and maybe even that kind of certain vintage feel as well. But I mean, it's in terms of creating horror, I think one of the things that the original Scream did really well, and it's something that Ito does as well, is kind of its imagery. It's like Moira was saying, picking that image. I've got images in my head from the original Scream, and I think this is part of the fact that because the creators weren't allowed to go nuts and they weren't allowed to go for the EC gore, that they had to really kind of think of images that would be creepy. And I'm thinking of things like the mum that's frozen into a tree in that little terror tale. There's the one of the bank managers with the big grins and the umbrellas shocking the guy in 13th Floor. And there was one, I can't remember which strip it was in. I think it was the very first issue where the kid runs into his parents' bedroom and the parents are asleep and there's these two ghosts sitting up in the bed. I mean, this is really chilling, creepy stuff, and it's things. It's the kind of thing that you want to wait for a page turn. I remember in one that always stuck with me was Mignola's The Wolves of St. August, the Hellboy story. There's this one page turn where you turn the page and there's a little girl at the bottom of the previous page, and you turn the page and the next one she's got a wolf's head, and it's just that sudden jarring thing. It really chills your blood. But I think as well, in horror, it's the character's intent. It's always things like that kind of dissonance you get when you read about. I had to do a project not too long ago where I had to read stuff about real life murders and things like the Moors murders and the Bulger case and stuff. And the thing that haunts you about those is, why would a human being do that to another human being, and how did it get to that? And people aren't supposed to behave that way. And when you read about the way things the Nazis did, you just think it's horrifying, because your brain can't compute that this is how a human being would function in this world. And so when you find stories that sprinkle that in, I mean, at the end of The Wicker Man, like one of the reasons why the ending is so horrifying is this: it's like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. You've got all these people coming together and just cold-bloodedly murdering this man, burning him to death as he's screaming, and and dancing while he's screaming. It's just it's horrible. And so that's just another tool that you can use in your arsenal of nastiness.
I think the color thing is really interesting, and it shows you how much we're value a good colorist, because I actually love horror black and white comics, but for instance, I love horror black and white film, but then I love something like Suspiria, which is super saturated, and it's going for a certain vibe. And actually, a good colorist can really bring a great deal to the story. And so all respect to the old colorists. I'm always happy to get a good one.
Yeah.
I think I like both. And again, when I wrote the story, though, I wasn't sure if it was going to be colored, and I wrote it in such a way that I thought that if it was going to be black and white, I thought someone could have fun with it too. Because I talk a lot about the shadows and suggested things in the story. But yeah, they're both good. They're just they do bring a different atmosphere.
I think it's also it gives you a different challenge. I mean, you look at horror films and you get something that's set in the shadows at night, and it's naturally creepy, and you're naturally expecting horror to happen. Then you look at something like Midsummer, where it's all beautiful and light and shiny and sunny, and it's all the more terrifying because in the middle of all that beauty, you've got horrific things happening. And I think the same can work in comics when you go black and white or color. You know, you open the page and you see a color spread, and depending on what kind of coloring in, whether it's a more sort of traditional superhero type coloring, you go, oh, I'm in that world, and then you can give the sucker punch. And I think if you know what you're going into, you can really use that as a tool to unnerve the reader in a way that they wouldn't expect if it was a traditional black and white or or lots of shadows.
I think
that's interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
Well, I'm just going to say horror as a genre, I think both in film and in comics, has this kind of power to borrow from lots of other genres. It can kind of seep into, like, kind of what you were saying, it seeps into the cracks of the textures of, okay, this is superheroes but horror, or this like is psychological thriller but there's horror, or this is sci-fi like Alien, which is ostensibly a horror film set on a space station with a real ghoul terrifying and like hunting the crew, so it's like a werewolf film in space. So you have, I think, the power with horror, and I think all of our stories, like, the editors have done a good job to curate the issue because it sounds like the issue does exactly that, both historical and gothic, and the melodrama of Dracula and the psychology of someone losing their mind, and the fun and colour of like more contemporary like teen drama or whatever. And mine's quite funny as well. It's kind of comedic, so comedy horror as well.
I was just going to say, like, when you've got the lower page count, you are up against it because you don't have room for all those lovely kind of aspect to aspect panels that build atmosphere. You've got like 7 pages you've got to get out, and that's those aspect to aspect panels that you see in a lot of like in a lot of manga was that's traditionally what you would do if you were trying to build atmosphere and give a sense of, why am I looking at this? Who's there? What should I be looking for? And it's the equivalent of the wandering camera. It's the equivalent of the camera wandering down the tunnels of the Nostromo in Alien, or whatever. It's like, why am I looking at this? It's creating that sense of unease. You haven't got that in comics. So again, you just sort of start looking at, you haven't got, not in comics, in short comics like we're working with. You just don't have that space. So you've got to just lean on other things and try the tools.
I think also one of the really great thing about comics as a medium, which is very unusual, I think it's maybe slightly exclusive to comics, is re-readability, which is that, most people reread comics, and often they read it for the text first, and then they go back and they pore over the images, and then they see things. And so that's, again, you really need your good artist there. Yeah. And, I usually seed lots of stuff, and it's up to the artist, what they put in. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the artifacts of comics that I love, is the fact that you start to see things you didn't see on your first read. I mean, obviously people rewatch movies, but it's like a lot of time, and rereading comics, especially when you're younger, is something you tend to do, especially when you're trying to figure out how comics work if you're a nerd like me.
One thing I wanted to pick up on was something that Alex said there, and we kind of talked about it earlier and said we'd come back to it, about the notion of the familiar, and how some of the best horror plays with feelings of security and undermining them. It's less so in Cavan and Alex's work for this special, but certainly for Maura and Kristyna, these are relatively recognizable scenarios that are then undermined by a fantastical, a horrific element. And was that something you were conscious of doing in those strips?
Yeah, I mean, I think I thought it was very interesting when they were, when Cavan and Alec were talking about various elements there in the comics that had really gripped them as kids. Because I actually think horror, and certainly obsession with horror, starts in childhood. And I think a lot of horror comes from childhood fears. Like you were describing the thing, it was always about parents. Parents in peril is a hugely frightening thing for children because they are your gods of your life. And if something was going to happen to them, that's a really difficult thing. So, and I think the home is definitely a source of horror. Like I just remember I had a super active imagination and I could imagine things in shadows in my house. There can't be a monster there. Like, how could there be a monster there? But when it's dark, and I remember we had a stairs and there was a light at each end of the landing, and if you didn't turn it, it could be dark when you went upstairs. And that was, my brain would have the monster that was hiding behind this this blank space where I couldn't see. And in my mind, there was a monster there and he was going to grab me unless I got up and turned the light on. This kind of thing when you're a kid is, and I also think that when you're a child, there's all these things you don't understand everything because parents are always saying things and you're thinking, I know I'm missing something here, and they have these conversations over your head while you're there. And I remember all of these kinds of things. And I think about that a lot when I'm writing, especially because this was aimed at a younger audience. Yeah. So the house and the home as a source of weirdness and horror. And it can be it doesn't have to be someone beating you though. That's a simple way to go with horror.
Yeah, I thought the same, but in interesting ways. I think growing up, the stuff that scared me, because I was raised Orthodox Catholic for a while, not anymore, but that is some spooky religion. It's like the devil's real, poltergeists are real. So there's this element of like the fantasy of biblical stories being parables, almost like myths, but then being told by those people who are your like guardians, there is an element of truth to that, and just being like, okay, all right, that's a lot to deal with when you're like 6. So like I always found like the scariest things came from very like authoritarian religious realms, because like things that shouldn't be real are real, or things that should be fantasy creep into reality. And I think that's kind of like tapping into mythology and bringing it dragging it somehow into a contemporary real kind of teen world, kind of taps into that perhaps a little bit with my story.
And it's the irrational fear of childhood as well. One of my biggest fears in my house, I don't know if I should even explain this, was when we had stairs that went up and then turned up to the landing, and there was a window at the top of the sort of turn. For some reason, as a child, I really believed that as I walked up there, a shark would burst through that window and get me at that point on the first floor of a building in Bristol. And there was nothing.
Bookstore is done.
I know, but there was nothing that anyone could tell me. They explain, well, sharks usually need water, and they're not very good at ladders, and they wouldn't be in Bristol anyway. But there was nothing that you could tell me to, for a certain point in my life, I really believed that was going to happen. And I think that it gets you across that idea that actually it's very easy to look at someone and go, oh, your fears are silly, what's a big tall bloke being scared of a spider, it's that kind of thing. But for the person who is afraid, it's so personal and it's so real, and and I think sometimes you've got to go back and remember what it was like to have those completely irrational fears, because in these stories there are monsters that will jump through the window and get you where they're not supposed to be, and so there is that idea that people know more than you and they're not quite letting on, and I think those things in all horror fans and all horror writers and creators, those things do stay with you, and you do mine those moments, even the most stupid and outlandish of them, because they are at their core just absolutely terrifying.
See, I had a Jaws related thing about that when I was a kid. Ben Gardner's head at the bottom of the boat, he would crawl around under my bed, and he would he dragged himself out
Wow.
the hole in the water, crawled ashore from Amity Island and come all the way to Tooting to hide under my bed. But yeah, I think the thing is, all of these fears, they're all rooted in something, and I think there is that universality of everything. I mean, if you take something like the zombie is all about fear of infection. It's about fear of crowds. It's about fear of ignorance. It's about it's the fear
of 2020.
Yeah, the fear of 2020. It's the fear of being at the bottom of the food chain and being eaten by something that's not supposed to eat you. So you've got that lovely bit of dissonance in there as well. And it's and again, it's interesting how these things kind of cycle around, because we're seeing now much more kind of social horror. I mean, if you look at I'm watching the Jordan Peele Twilight Zones at the moment, and there's some absolutely fantastic stuff in there. And it's about seeing things from over there and over here, but again, that all these things are still rooted in a sense of society's unstable and it's out to get me, and that runs through what was the first that runs through Get Out. It runs through the you've seen the Twilight Zone episode he did with the camcorder that sends them back in time. It's brilliant. I thought it's absolutely brilliant. But again, at the root, those things, they may wear different masks, but at the root, we all go through that in some way. They just express themselves in different ways. And yeah, so all of these, in the same way that characters need to be relatable and characters need to be understandable, if not relatable, and so do settings and everything. So you get that kind of universal experience that the reader has, that they can actually give a damn about what you're writing. So yeah, those fears all have these undercurrents that we all go through, I guess.
It's interesting that we've talked about the Wicker Man specifically because Maura's got it behind it, but also as one of those films that is horrific, I think, because and I picked this up in a few of the stories in the Misty special. There's the heart drop moment, which I find as scary as a jump scare, where you realize it's too late. Safety has passed you by. You are beyond the point of no return. There's a wonderful line from Auden's Consider This, which is, it is later than you think. I just, that's very 2020 for me at the moment, and that for me, so much of the modern horror that I'm watching and reading seems to pick up on that, the sense of safe, you're past that point where you can be safe again, and that's more horrific. What's coming is coming, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Lovecraft Country, like, one of the things I love about, say, especially the first episode, is it's like, it's real. You know what I mean? There's no, oh, is it or isn't it? Because sometimes I do find that a bit annoying in horror, which is like, is it real or isn't it real? Sometimes I want to know, it's real and it's a monster and it's coming for you. And then I'm like, yes, I'm all in. I want that monster chasing me, or, well, not me, literally. But I think the horror of today is very, very interesting. We're locked up in our homes. I think the horror industry is going to go through an explosion, but I'm not sure if people are going to be ready for it, because I think our people are fatigued probably by isolation stories, you know. So, but yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting to think about what is, you know, what's getting traction at the moment. One of the things I find interesting is a type of horror. It's a bit in Lovecraft country, which is that sort of cosmic alien quality, which is you didn't do anything wrong, you're just screwed. You know, yeah. The monster's going to get you, and it's out there. It's like you see this a lot in Asian horror. You know, it's just these monsters are here, these ghosts are here, these entities are here. You've just like tripped across them, and now they're coming for you, and they won't stop. And they're alien to you. They don't think like humans. You know, they're just coming for you. And that's another type of really frightening horror, because it's it can manifest itself in very scary ways, or they've brilliant stuff where it's used through technology. Technology as a source of fear is something we're seeing a lot of, and that is going to continue, I think, too.
It was always a thing that in Victorian horror, because there was always that moral element. So long as you went to church and you said your prayers and you were good to your neighbours, you'd be fine. And then J. Sheridan Le Fanu came along in late 1800s or something, and he wrote a story called Green Tea. And it was about this academic who was haunted by this ghostly simian face that would just appear and just whisper things in his ears. And he would go through, well, is it because I haven't been at church? Is it because I've been reading too much of these weird philosophy books? Is it because I drink too much green tea? Who knows? You're screwed. and that's that again, you create that sense of uncertainty, and there's nothing I can do to save myself here. There's no rules. I'm kind of stuffed.
I love it when a conversation follows roughly the points that I've written down.
Not to do any work then.
Right. Because morality is literally something I want to talk about, because the notion of comeuppance is so strong in comics like Scream and Misty. You know, you can't read something like The 13th Floor without knowing that there is a fundamental morality at play there. That if you are a nasty person, if you are morally abhorrent or aberrant, then you're going to get what's coming to you. And I after the discussion we've just had about changing tastes in horror, I wanted to get your feelings on you know, what your individual stories do in terms of that kind of morality, and whether you think that still has a part to play in comics aimed at a YA audience, for example.
Mine's got a massive morality through line. But I think because it's based on like myths, so there's this element of like traditional villains and revenge and someone wielding power, and power being something that might corrupt you. So because it's based on this classical shield that turns people to stone, wielded by Medusa, it's also got the classical themes of, well, you might fight for justice, but you might be corrupted by power. And also ideas of revenge, like somebody being like feeling like they're justified in their hatred because of something that happened to them in legacy that they then kind of carry with them, and that becomes a corrupting force as well, which are huge like horror themes, like just standards really. But it was fun to kind of play with them and have fun kind of mashing those up into this like melting pot of classical and contemporary.
I thought the screen had frozen for a moment there.
Then no.
In saying that, I forgot to press the space bar to unmute myself.
The horror!
I wonder what happened.
Anybody would think it was a Friday afternoon.
I'm glad it was just you that was muted, and I had just been like miming for 3 minutes or whatever. That's the horror of Zoom.
Yeah. The other week I watched Unfriended, which is a 2014 horror movie, which I thought was going to be terrible, but actually I really, really enjoyed. And although it is about the evils of social media and all this, that, and the other, feels very real right now, when this is how you interact with people. So constantly just checking behind me, not that
you should, to be honest.
Paranormal does a lot of that, and that kind of found footage stuff. I mean, this has been a recurring theme in horror probably like 10 or even 15 years. I've seen quite a lot of horror films that used stories that were told via video footage, and it's very cheap and safe way to make a horror film.
Mike, who's that behind you?
That's a very dark corner there.
I mean, talking about this is fairly common, but talking about irrational fears, mirrors in bathrooms. I mean, when I look at them, I'm terrified anyway. But it's the number of times, particularly as a kid and teenager, I would keep my eyes fixed on the floor while brushing my teeth at night for fear that there'd be somebody in the mirror.
Yeah. Well, you told
it's
story about the same, either the Candyman thing made it popular, but were you told that when you were a kid? You know, if you say someone's name 4 times.
But it was Bloody Mary, and then I watched
Bloody
Candyman,
Mary.
and I was like, don't even think Candyman 3 times, otherwise he's going to be here. And then I was like, and don't think Bloody Mary. Oh, I've already thought it once.
You've said it twice now.
Oh no!
Well, I never got that. I think what it came from was like I mentioned, I was raised in a religious household, so the notion of ghosts, even though we were Protestant, the notion of ghosts was still present. You know, afterlife and all this, that, and the other. And while Methodist churches are not known for being particularly gothic, they can be creepy in their own right. So.
But it is a lack of control. All of this comes back to a lack of control. And when you're dealing with ghosts, when you're dealing with things in the mirrors, it's completely out of your frame of influence. And again, it's the difference between a thriller and a horror movie. You know, a thriller can have horror elements, but the hero or the heroine will get out of it at the end, you know, because of things they do, they will save the day. A true horror film will leave them in worse situation than they started. And I think that's what horror has at its heart. And that's why it's so prevalent. And that's why it always comes back, just like Michael Myers, because you can't stop it. Because it is, cosmic horror is probably horror at its purest, because there's nothing you can do. And I think that's why ghosts still, one of the creepiest things for me isn't in a traditional horror story, but it is in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, where there's a moment when Dickens says the bed curtains by his head pulled back, not the ones at his feet, the ones by his head, which are as close to me as I am with you, and I am at your shoulder in spirit. And it's just that thought of like, go away, Charles Dickens. I don't want you anywhere near me. And there's nothing you can do about the fact that Charles Dickens is just there talking to you, and you can close the books and he's still there. And that's why horror is scary, because no matter what you do, Charles Dickens is always with you. No, I think I got confused there.
You know, even with the one of the things that's not often done is, you know, where he pulls open his chest and inside are the 2 children. And the famished children who are with me always. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, all the various versions, I think I've watched all the versions of Christmas Carol and read it, obviously. Every different one does different things that I love. Such a great story.
Yeah, that scene is even scary in the Muppets Christmas Carol.
It is, it's great. And the Muppets one is particularly good.
Yeah, it is.
I think a lot of horror, it's like, say, with cosmic horror, I think any strain of horror, whether it's quiet horror or body horror or whatever, it always needs to end with a sense that the universe is broken, that something's not quite right, that good people are punished, things aren't quite right, that you've glimpsed behind the veil and the world is not as you thought it was before we started off, you know?
Well, also the hero is not the same. Well, I use hero gender neutral now, I have to say. You know, they are not the same. So even if things are somewhat better, they're shattered. And they will never view the world again in the same fashion.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get quite psychoanalytical about that, to be honest with you, but I want to bring it back to comics. And when the British comics was having its generally acknowledged heyday in the 70s and 80s, you know, there were dozens of titles, and you had Scream and Misty, and they would appear for so many issues and then disappear. And I wanted to get your views on the value of horror comics as not just a genre, but as like a commercial proposition. So almost like you know, is horror just for Halloween, or is it for all year round kind of thing?
I think, yeah, it's always, I mean, yeah, it's, again, I mean, if in terms of the things that you want to say, and yeah, I mean, horror's always been relevant. I think horror comics, probably horror graphic novels now, really, in kind of today's market. But I mean, yeah, totally. I mean, it's in again, it depends entirely on what you want to say. I mean, it's as we're seeing now with movies like Get Out and Us and the Jordan Peele stuff, it's great at dissecting things that we're trying to work out at the moment, whether that's the rise of fascism, whether that's social inequality. There are great ways in which they can be turned into metaphor and explored in another way that can give us new insights and view things from a different way. So yeah, 100%. I think talking about that sense of hopelessness, as you were saying about specifically British comics, I've always thought that hopelessness has always been very British anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at things like I'm thinking about the English Office, the TV show, thinking of things like Red Dwarf, Monty Python, Warhammer. There is this sense of everything is broken, everything is a joke, everything is awful, and we're just going through it anyway. It's so maybe British comics are uniquely positioned to explore horror. Discuss.
Yeah, but
I think it's
you talk
absolutely
about the heyday of British comics being the 70s and 80s. That's a direct response to Thatcherism and neoliberalism and like wealth inequality, like striding out from the 70s into the 80s, which I feel we're in a renaissance in the 2020s. So perhaps that's why it feels so much more relevant now.
Yeah.
And especially, I think, when you're dealing with comics, horror comics for younger readers and for kids and for teens, having worked on some horror comics for younger people on the other side of the pond as well, we have a very distinct British way of thinking over here of how much you can show, how much you can scare, how much you can make life uncomfortable for young readers, which I think, again, is wrapped up in that era of, it's wrapped up in everything. You know, children's TV in the 70s and 80s, let's face it, over here, was absolutely terrifying and should always be, and scarred us all. And, you know, there's so many reasons why we're all, you know, needing therapy now, mainly because of things like Children of the Stones. And a lot of the American market that I've worked with just don't get it. I was writing some kids' horror books and sent them some of the pictures from the Fighting Fantasy Choose Your Own Adventure books, and they lost their minds. That they were for children. I was like, yep, they were for people like me, and it explains a lot.
Yeah.
And it's that sense of, I don't think in British, whether it's comics or literature for younger readers, we don't necessarily wrap them up in cotton wool as much. You know, there is a sense of like the world is scary, and you're going to have to get used to it because it's not going to change, pal. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of British horror.
I think that's because people always come back to the 70s and things like 2000 AD and say, oh, well, it was really good. We had no standards and practices back then. I mean,
no.
Remember the Top Trumps horror cards?
Yeah.
I mean, they should never have been given to children. Are you insane? Like you had literally this thing. I remember this one of this thing it was called The Thing, and it was like whacking this woman's head off, and her head is coming back, and her eyes are rolling back, and there's vertebrae. It's like, but this content was put together by post-war creators who would have been playing on bomb sites in their youth. It would never have occurred to them to. They were having uncles and fathers coming back from the front telling them, yeah, the things we saw over there. And these creators would never have thought to kind of sugarcoat anything.
No.
And I think that's why we got that little flashpoint in the 70s and early 80s when, oh my God, this stuff was just wild. And you look at it now and think, yeah, we shouldn't have been handing out Top Trump's horror cast to kids.
It's that Scarred for Life thing where, even the safety movies that were meant to keep us safe by scaring the crap out of us.
The one with Donald Pleasance telling as Death saying, "Don't go in the water," because you'll end up in this puddle drowned. It's one of the best horror films ever made.
Yeah, but Kevin, did you ever fall into a pond and drown?
Apparently not. I'm still here.
There you go. Did its job.
Lifelong fear of ponds.
Yeah.
And I never played frisbee near a power station.
Yeah.
It was It's definitely helped me in life.
Yeah, it's funny because I was raised in Ireland, but we consumed pretty much a great deal of British, more than American. Certainly prior to the internet, you wouldn't just wouldn't be able to get it. So I think that sensibility is shared by us, but also, I think I've said this before on previous 2000 AD podcast, is that Irish people have still, despite they may deny it, have a very strong sense of the liminal and of the supernatural. And our landscape is littered with runes, and we're talking some going back 5,000 years. And there's all myths and mythology about the people under the hills who come out at night, which would be, say, the Tuatha De Danann. Everybody says they don't believe in fairies, but they all have a fairy story. I don't believe in fairies, but and so we have a lot of the trappings of Gothic and of that stuff all around us. So we tend to have a very sort of pragmatic attitude about these things, and there is a sense that they are there. We just can't see them, but just don't invite them. Don't draw too much attention.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this discussion. So thank you all for chatting away and revealing so much of your own fears and emotional scars. Here's hoping that we scar a few more with the Misty Scream special. So really appreciate it. Thanks very much, everybody.
Nice stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Super. Many thanks to Kristyna, Cavan, Maura and Alec for chatting away there. I hope you enjoyed that. Now, back in 2004, Pat Mills and Charlie Adlard revived a character that many thought was long gone, Bill Savage from Invasion. He was one of the first characters in 2000 AD, fighting against the Volgs as they invaded Britain. It was one of those strips that in hindsight, very much of its time. And so lots of people weren't entirely sure whether he would work in a different setting. But what Pat and Charlie and then Patrick Goddard did was revived Savage for a new era, a post 9/11 era. And the new series talked about authoritarianism, the Iraq War, corporatism, and then began to merge into the Mills verse with the arrival of the Hammerstein robots. So really fascinating series, and Claire Napier, who is a comics critic and writer and editor, asked to do a deep dive on this. So it was an absolute pleasure to talk to her about Bill Savage. So grab your shooter. That was a terrible accent. I'm not even going to try and attempt that again. Before we crack on, I know you've been on the podcast before, but do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Hello, listeners and viewers. I'm Claire Napier. I was a critic, I still am, for many years at Women Write About Comics. I've moved into freelance editing and having fun with comics. It's a lifestyle.
Definitely not a nightmare. No, comics will break your heart. So you've chosen for this deep dive to talk about Savage and, by natural extension, Invasion, which was Pat Mills and Jerry Finley Day, and a host of artists: Jesus Blasco, Pat Wright, Sarampus. Mine has gone suddenly incredibly blank. Charlie Adlard. He's not going to forgive that. And Patrick Goddard. Do you want to explain your thinking about wanting to do a deep dive into Savage?
Well, I will, but first of all, I've got to point out that you've missed one.
Oh no. Who?
Disaster 1990.
Oh, of course. Ah, yes.
The prequel.
I can tell it's going to be a proper deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, my sweetie and I have been doing what I believe is widely known as the prog slog.
Mm-hmm.
So we started right at the beginning. And Bill Savage in Invasion, it wasn't immediately my favorite strip because Invasion is about Britain being invaded by the Volg, who are fairly clearly just Russians by another name. It was the Cold War, I guess. And in fact, in Savage, that's made totally clear. Mills went back and just laid it out. This is why they're called the Volg. It's because of the river Volga or whatever. But they never say it to start with it. So it's just it from a modern perspective, it seems like sort of social responsibility. Like, we're not just gonna pretend that the Russians are invading Britain. We're just gonna use that motif, which everyone understands, to tell this story about people fighting against generalized depression. So it has kind of a like an iffy appeal, I guess, to someone who, is on the left or whatever. Because it's very like our boys kind of thing, which doesn't usually get me going, really. It's a bit creepy, but Bill Savage is just a fun guy. Like, he's mad. He's sent crazy by the loss of his family, his wife and unstated number of children. In Savage, it's revealed to be there were two of them, but they get killed by a stray shell when the Volg invade Britain, and that sends him round the bend. He's now living only for revenge and resistance, even though the country, like Britain, has fallen to the Volgs because of their nuclear strike. I think it's called the 8-Hour War, which is pretty snappy. It's a cool sounding thing. It's very 2000 AD. So yeah, he's just this lorry driver. That's why he wasn't at home when his family got killed. He was out driving his lorry, and he gets home and they're dead, and he finds his shotgun is still working. So he's like, right, that's all I need. My truck, my shotgun. I'm gonna push the Volg out of the country. But he does it in such a way that he it just tickles the funny bone. He is so devil may care, and he loves a bit of a joke. He's a punster in the first go around, which is not really something that was held over when the Savage series revisited the character. But there's a lot of just good reading, like a good time to be had reading Bill Savage in his first outing.
It's interesting that you bring up the whole Volgan thing, because of course originally it was meant to be the Russians, and for whatever reason it was decided that that was a bit too on the nose, particularly in 1977, and there's a historical context to that which is very interesting. because the first episode of Invasion refers to it as the Volgan Empire, the Volgan Republic of Asia, and certainly in those early episodes, it feels as if there's a bit of a muddle in the minds, not necessarily of Pat or of Jerry, but certainly in the minds of the artists about who they're actually meant to be portraying. Because one minute they look like the stereotypical bullish Russians, so for want of a better phrase, and I'm not an ethnologist by any stretch of the imagination, but kind of notions of Western Russians, so you kind of Muscovites, the kind of troops that you would see marching through Red Square. But then at various little points, it almost seems that they do take on a more kind of Asiatic look. And so very early on, I think that there's a parallel very clearly being drawn between this and your kind of war comics. So it places it in the realm of things like Battle, Darky's Mob, and stories like that. What do you think the Volgans represent in not just the minds of the creators, but also in the minds of the readers at this time, considering what's happening in the world in 1977, 1978?
Honestly, it's hard for me to say without just guessing, because I haven't really read a lot of war comics. They don't really hold a lot of appeal for me. I wasn't born at this time. So I can only guess that it was mimetic. There would be general stuff in the news about this or that Russian politics happening, just enough to like drip through into the child's awareness of the world. And when your country is not at war, which everyone knows, then you know it too, and so you have the picture of the villain. And when that is then reflected on the page, it just seems natural, I would expect. Just, these are the people who would get us if they were offered the opportunity, as we see here on the page.
Also, I think that there's something very particular to Invasion as a strip, in that it nicely expresses for me the frustrating stasis of the Cold War for people, for children at the time, because you as you say, you're not at war. Your country is not involved technically in an armed conflict with the Russians, for example. And yet the language, particularly in the late 70s, moving into the 80s with the rise of Reagan, the language is increasingly warlike. So you are both, it's kind of Schrodinger's war, really. You are both not at war and at war at exactly the same time, which is one of the paradoxes of the Cold War. With this, I think there's something wonderfully British about Invasion, because of course you have that opening episode where it's Angela Rippon who is announcing the invasion, and you have what most people take to be Thatcher being executed on the steps of St Paul's, but of course it's Lady Shirley Brown.
Lady Shirley Brown, yeah.
There's lots of people that could be, emblematic of. But let's talk specifically about Savage.
Okay.
Because he feels as if he belonged in the same category as Judge Dredd, who debuted just an episode later. And I wonder what your thoughts.
Category would be.
Well, in the kind of single-minded, borderline insane, they have one mission.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think Savage is slightly, I guess more human, because he's not the law. And also in that because he's not the law, there's like a bit more of a class consciousness in Savage throughout. It's not like super there, but it kind of mixes up with the Cold War question for me, because my parents and all my uncles are of an age to have been reading 2000 AD at this time. And they never spoke to me about, like, I've never heard them talk about the Cold War in any sense at all. I really only know about what the Cold War meant for people through watching American media. Like, I don't really know what it was like for British people, because I haven't seen it anywhere else. Like, outside of this strip, I just don't know where it was reflected. But my uncles have talked a lot about Thatcher stealing their milk. So when the Lady Shirley Brown appeared being shot, I thought, this I understand. Like, I know where this is coming from psychically. But then in Savage, when the series becomes called Savage in the 2000s revival, Lady Shirley Brown is Bill Savage's personal hero. And that's written in a way that I'm not sure whether it's Savage who is saying that as the character or Savage who is saying that as the strip. There's a small amount, but a definite amount of actual class discussion between Savage and his friends, and his allies and his enemies. There's a whole thing about how it can't be Savage in this particular instance because he's allied with a group from the left and they don't get on because Savage was in favor of Lady Shirley Brown and her policies, which allowed him to buy his council house, whereas other freedom fighters and Savage keeps and his friends keep complaining about how true Labour got into power in the 90s and made American troop bases leave Britain. And that was what allowed the Volks to actually invade Britain. Therefore, true Labour, as in this sort of murky idea of what Labour politics actually stand for rather than what they've been used to stand for in actual politics in real life, were a bad thing, according to Bill Savage, because it led to the Volks, but also because he just felt differently before that. So it gets more applicable, I suppose. Like the thought experiments that it's asking you to do are more practical than any I have personally encountered in Judge Dredd.
Because all the way through, even as the strip moves into being Savage, Savage seems to go out of his way to constantly reinforce that his vendetta is personal. It's not ideological. So when he comes up against ideologues, when he comes up against causes that aren't his own, he rejects them. He moves against them. He doesn't trust them. Because to a certain extent, I think, and coming into the point you were making just there, causes, ideologies are where what has led them to this point in the first place, and keep screwing people up. So it is a very personal thing. And also, I absolutely what you're saying about the issues around working class support for Thatcher in the 1980s, which for many people are baffling, because look at what Thatcherite monetarist policies did to manufacturing jobs and the miners and all this, that, and the other. But there's a lot more sort of cultural undercurrents there than straightforward class divisions. In terms of Savage's personal quest, do you think it is something that adequately sustains the strip as it evolves? Because you can see it as a kind of momentary revenge story, but this is a thread that runs throughout the entire thing, isn't it?
Yes, apart from Disaster 1990, because it hasn't happened yet. I'm not sure, honestly, because I did find my personal investment flagging towards the end of the more recent Savage stories. Like, they were compelling in themselves, but not so much as Bill Savage stories. There was a sort of waning character, I guess. The premise of Bill Savage remains, in so much as it was he is against the Volks, but because the revival Savage stories did go a bit further into his family and his feelings and his personal response, and the Adlard segment did kind of end with a sense of closure. He lays flowers on their graves. After that, it feels not bad, but tired. You share the sense of, is it still not over with the character, I suppose, which is effective, but it's tiring. You might not prefer to continue reading something that is only offering a sense of empathy with someone who is really tired by endless war. But I think it's hard to say. I do think that, like, certain aspects of the character are gradually chipped away, because I do actually think that he is an ideologue in one sense, which is that he always chooses to save lives if possible, and preventatively, and in a way that is, well, my gran and great aunt lived in Coventry in the Second World War. They were kids. So when I see a character who is specifically, like, centered as someone who has, clout, who can direct decisions being made in wartime, and he always chooses the ones which will allow the least loss of life, that seems to me quite purposefully being written as different from what actual governments actually do, including the actual British government, the last time we had a war on us. So that does seem like a fairly solid statement of, like, Bill Savage intent. He's not a general. He doesn't tactic in that way. He saves lives as his number one thing, as well as being against Volks. And as is pointed out somewhere that I lost, but I was just reading other people's reflections on the strip. In one of those later stories, he just machine guns a whole restaurant full of people because they may have been collaborating in some way, which Bill is, degrading if that is the decision the character's made. So he doesn't tell jokes anymore. He doesn't, like, pull a gun out of a bubble bath under a rubber ducky, which is something that he did in the first strip, which was marvelous. There's no fun left, and there's also no, almost grace, I suppose. So it becomes more of a war strip and less of a, like, jaunt, I guess.
It's interesting you mentioned about humour, because that, and coming back to my question about whether he fits into the same category as Dredd, that black humour has always has always been a part of Dread's world, but as you say, has faded away with Bill Savage. And reading a lot about characters like Dirty Harry, upon which Dredd is partly based, where you have the one-liner, the quip at the end, that allows you as a viewer to laugh with somebody who has just done something horrific, and the catharsis of the laugh breaks it open, and you're not necessarily in the horror of the moment. Without that humour, do you think the satirical points, in later Savage land better, or are disadvantaged by that lack of humour?
I think they land bitter, which I can't blame, but it is less pleasant to read. I don't know that the satirical elements will have less effect on people who are enjoying this new type of strip. It's hard to say. But I think I think that removing the humor has not necessarily forced, like it might be the other way around, but the messaging is more straightforward, I think, in the later strips. There's a bit where a guy who Bill thought was kind of on his side turns out to not be on his side and actually be collaborating with the Volks by producing all this pulp fiction, like bodice rippers and sci-fi. And he just straight up says, I've been doing this to make all the people think that everything's fine because it's not as bad as it could be in the fiction. So they're all just zombies and they won't fight back. And we've just got to sit down and understand the Volks are here to stay. And as satire goes, I don't know if that counts, because that's just sort of a statement, and I don't know if it's a statement. I don't know what kind of statement it is. I don't know if that's saying, what the hell am I doing? But I don't know what else it quite could be. I don't know if the reader is supposed to think, I have been reading these comics and therefore ignoring real world politics, and now I will something. I don't know what the purpose is. I'm thinking about it, so maybe that's enough, but I'm not sure that it has. I don't know if it impacts me differently to the earlier strips where I was having a good time. Like, I don't know if it does more or less. I don't know if it's supposed to do more or less. I find Pat Mills a very, very interesting writer, but I don't know that I understand him as an intentioned writer. So it's hard to answer.
It's certainly the stories in Savage are a lot more polemical, a lot more didactic than they are in the stuff he was writing for Invasion. But of course, you know, there's also the influence of Jerry Finley Day, who did a massive chunk of that initial story. And
Disaster 1990.
And Disaster 1990. Keep reading that, don't you? But he's a much more straightforward action writer. You know, as I've said on the podcast before, he's a great ideas man. You know, Jerry's one of those people who just came up with fantastic concepts, and then structured the story in fairly this isn't the criticism of Jerry in any way, shape, or form, but in fairly conventional ways, in that he was writing in a certain genre and in a certain industry. So once you get into Savage, and Pat is throwing ideas and technology, it feels like the concept of the strip is very different, in that it's trying to do a completely different thing to what the source material was doing.
Yeah, yes and no, I think. It's just sort of, I mean, almost because it's 2000 AD, throughout there are, it kind of feels like if you could add Bill Savage, like all of his appearances up together, and then deal them out between the lunatic and the straightforward. Because, I mean, Jerry Finley Day has him, for example, in Disaster 1990, team up with a hydrologist and fight a Birdman. a mad old man with a bird call whistle who can control birds. And the birds fight Bill Savage. But then Mills in Savage has teleporting tigers.
Yeah.
Which is also, on the face of it, quite silly. So it's not almost ever a tonally straightforward product. And being a product of these two different guys who seem to have the same, not the same perspective, but they seem to be looking at the same landscapes, because they both have those like elements of the ridiculous and the class conscious, because Bill and Professor Bamber also try and go to Oxford, where all the dons have surrounded Oxford with poison gas so that they can rebuild society with only the brainy. And they both have Bill disliking fascists, basically. But they do it in different ways, and the fact that they take turns doing these same disparate things in their same but disparate ways make it sort of hard to look at as a whole.
Because what do you think ultimately, and this probably better off at the end of this conversation, but I'll do it now. What do you think is the point of the strip? What do you think is the message of Savage?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that's something that I appreciate about it, that I don't know what it wants me to think, so I can just enjoy it. I don't know. I just don't. It's too weird. And aspects that seemed initially very important, like in Invasion and in Disaster 1990, Savage, the London hard man, gets a sidekick who's posh and fancy and wears glasses in both of them, two different guys. And that fits extremely naturally with, even though one and a lot of the other is written by Finlay Day, Pat Mills' stated goal of class consciousness in comics, and he has, I think it might be in the foreword, but it might be somewhere else, to the Invasion omnibus thing, that he wanted to put working class heroes in situations where they were not subject to the orders of the upper classes. And so in both these situations, he's given an upper class person to tell what to do. But then there's none of that in Savage. So was that important to Savage particularly or not? I don't know. Again, it slips out of the fingers.
I think you're entirely right about Pat's intentions in terms of working class heroes, and it's something that, around about the same time he was doing with Charlie's War, and the giving of a sidekick who is technically above him in the hierarchy is a nice inversion of the usual way it always was. You'd get the officer with the kind of plucky working class Batman, as it were. But I think the overriding theme that I always get out of all of, let's just forget Disaster 1990.
All right.
is anti-authoritarian. It is a rejection of authority, and it is Savage is almost like a kind of self-made Ubermensch in that he is assuming moral authority because of his situation. He is rejecting all authority that has led him to the point where his family is dead, his country is destroyed, everything is in ruins. That's the consequence of those in charge. You know, they've brought us to this point, and that carries all the way through. And I think, you know, I mentioned Charlie's War there, but also, you know, Action was still warm in its grave by the point 2000 AD actually started, and Savage feels the most Action that 2000 AD was in those early days, in that it's roughly contemporary. It is dealing with recognizable places and with recognizable people, and Action was all about anti-authority, you know, about rejecting that punk notion of those in charge do not have your best interests at heart.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but it's not, I wouldn't say that it's like through and through, because like Bill Savage personally does reject authority, but he doesn't reject it for everyone, because he does spend a lot of time looking after the prince in Invasion, trying to get him off to America so that the royal family can be safe for Britain. And there's almost an interrogation of it in Savage when people keep urging him. At the end of most of his stories, someone urges him to be in charge, and he's like, no, that's not for me, and he walks off into the sunset. But there seems to be at one point like a sort of change in that, and in his most recent story, he is an authority figure, and he has the authority to offer people deals which the government will later honor. And he also spends that whole story wearing glasses and looking completely different, so it's just very confusing. So yeah, I think you're right, but I don't know that I couldn't call it straightforward anti-authoritarianism, because he kind of just wants to be left alone, but because he wants to be left alone, he doesn't want everyone else running around doing whatever they want, because then they might bother him. So he kind of maybe is a tiny bit of a slight hypocrite. I wouldn't say that to his face. Well, I might. He'd probably be fine with that. Because who isn't, right?
True, very true. What are some of your favourite parts of Savage? Are there, I mean, you've already mentioned at least a couple. Are there particular moments when you're like, absolutely, like this is the best of this?
Well, the rubber duck is the best part because it's just so silly. And it's not just that it's silly as a moment, it's that it's silly for the character. So you can sort of see not a weaker, but, you know, a more vulnerable, more human core, because he's goofing around. And that is a human quality that allows connection to be built. I like everything where Big Nessie is involved. Bill's friend from the road, another trucker, a large Scottish woman who is very good at swimming and killing voles. But they're pals, and that's a good thing to see from a tough guy hero, that he has a friend who is a woman who he doesn't be bad to. And she's fun in her own right. So I like the bit where, spoiler, he's sad when Silk gets killed, because again, human connection. I like a lot of bits from Disaster 1990.
All right, let's talk about it. Because it's I think it raises interesting questions about the notion of apocalypse and a very British, very English way of looking at the apocalypse. Because in Invasion, you've got an invasion of outsiders, but in Disaster 1990, it is a disaster. It is an act of God. Why?
Well, it is a silly idea, and that is charming in the first place. Like, Bill Savage before he is sent crazy, what was he like, you know? There's a funny bit in, I think, the first chapter. Is there a word for like the little bit of the chapter in the issue? Prog. Thrill? The first thrill? I just want to, you know, I want to use the right vocabulary. Where he's in a truck in a cafe and the news is on, and he makes some comment about how nowadays all news is read by women because that's a way to show this is happening in the future. That was hilarious to me. How ridiculous. And it's nice to see this character who you know being a certain way and a certain age and look a certain way, because the visuals of Bill Savage was very consistent from throughout Invasion. It got a little wobbly towards the end, but to begin with, very, very good on model illustration, which is always a plus, because if you can recognize someone, then you feel more familial towards them. So it's nice seeing him be a bit younger when his hairline is a little thicker and he's a bit more charming and he hasn't met his wife yet. He doesn't meet her in this story, which was a letdown. So yeah, I mean, if anyone is thinking, what can I add to the Bill Savage story? I would like to see that, please. It's like, for one thing, a climate disaster is a topical notion for the reader of today. And it is just, the whole story is incredibly goofy, because you know that everything is going to be fine, because it has to be, because when Bill Savage began his invasion adventure, the whole land was not flooded, so it's going to go away. The magazine has established itself as that solid on continuity that you can trust absolutely that this will be all cleared up in time for the other thing to happen. It's just it's a never-ending parade of these fun new characters who do weird stuff that is always directly related to the disaster and to the what's happening, but it's just always something different. So you get to see creative innovation. And he just has to sort out loads of people. And they keep teasing him getting a shotgun, which is his weapon of choice, like his trademark. And then he loses it, and then he gets it again, and then he loses it. It's just fun. It's fun to read. It's just a pleasant time spent looking at a man who you like.
Let's briefly talk about that shotgun, because we could have a whole discussion about the totemic notion of specific types of firearm in comic books. But I love the fact that it's a shotgun that is chosen, because that's a working man's gun. It's not a spy's gun. It's not a policeman's gun. It is a gun for somebody who works on a farm. You'd expect a farmer to have one. It's a working class weapon, but it does become totemic in the strip, doesn't it? In Invasion.
Yeah, in Savage, in fact, after he has changed his face, he's spotted by suspicious operatives because he uses his shotgun with such aplomb. They're like, must be him. It's that guy with the shotgun. Which I can't say I find especially convincing, because I think probably a lot of people have shotguns, but it's nice. So, sure, It's agreeable to read. It makes it a better story than if it was a strictly accurate story. I don't know that I personally respond to the shotgun as only a working class weapon, honestly, because I associate it with, the grouse.
Ah, right, okay.
But that makes it seem more of an English weapon, I suppose, because it is the only type of gun that seems like reasonable for an English person to have, for whether they're doing farm work or whether they're doing land ownership work. So it makes sense in its position as a defender of the land, and it gives almost like a common ground between these upper and lower class people that he has to meet. Like, he's got a shotgun. Oh, I've got one too. Like, there's a they can talk about something.
Everyone's got to have hobbies.
Yeah.
One thing I did really enjoy rereading Invasion for the first time in quite a long time, actually, was the predictions of the near future that it goes through. So obviously, female prime minister and all this, that, and the other. But also, there's a wonderful page, and I think it's Pat, actually. Let me just double check. Who wrote it? Hang on. Oh, PDFs! I hate you so much. Yeah, Train Story. So this was Prog 7, so this is still fairly early on. And there's a scene of Paddington Station and like the entrance to the platform, and it says new cheap day returns to Oxford, only £234.
Yeah.
That was as accurate a prediction as 2000 AD ever got.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the kind of near future setting? Is that something that is fundamental to the appeal of a strip like Invasion?
I did find it very delightful, because it is all so old-fashioned. So it has its basic retro appeal, but also the retro appeal of knowing better, having been there. It's sort of, I think Bill being, a working man, allows for that almost more than other strips, because the machismo of working class people and also the practicality means that there's less obvious flamboyant differentiation via era, whereas in a strip like Mac 1, which is supposed to be set it's also in the future, but it's not as far in the future, but the guy wears flares. It seems a little bit like it's sillier. It seems more misjudged than Bill wearing straight leg work trousers in 1999. Like, people wore those. They just did. I honestly don't remember many specifics of the future prediction stuff from Invasion. It's been a little while since I read it. The retro in Savage, when they sort of turn it inside out by having the E-bombs that knock out technology. So everyone keeps talking about it having been sent back to the 1980s. I found more confusing than reading the stuff from the past, imagining a future that didn't happen that way. Because it looked sort of the same as the predictions that didn't come true, which seems like it just seems wrong somehow. I felt like it put me more on watch I suppose, for decisions around technology and style, and I didn't quite understand the point so much as I understood the point of imagining things that could happen in the future that didn't. Like, that's just someone trying and getting it wrong. Whereas the more modern people having to use a record player and being surprised that it doesn't work with CDs. They wouldn't. People know what record players are even now, and it baffled me a little bit, because I don't understand what the point of that is beyond nostalgia for the people who I guess maybe were reading the first time around and are still reading, and so, but that's not me, so I can't really relate to that. So it was trickier that way than the other.
Let's talk more about Savage. So post 9/11, Pat decides to revive Savage as a character, and very clearly using it as an allegory for what the military-industrial complex is doing with the invasion of Iraq, and the increasing authoritarian militarization of policing in the West. And like I said, the tone of the strip becomes a lot more didactic. There's a lot less humor. It's a much more of a kind of political thriller than it necessarily had been before. What are your thoughts on the value of restarting a character like Savage, and at that particular point in history?
I don't want it to sound like I didn't enjoy reading these comics, because I did, but I would be against it. Because of the criticisms that I do have of the change in tone and the change in observable purpose. Because it's framed like a continuation, when it's not a continuation. It's a different moment in history, I suppose. It's a response to different matters that is trying to use the old response to the other matters to create a new response to these different matters. That's too jumbly, I think, because I didn't think about those politics while I was reading these comics. So I just thought, there was less apparent metaphor to me reading today, which obviously disadvantages it somewhat because I am not in that moment. But I think that kind of just proves what I'm saying, because it was obvious that Invasion was a Cold War story, but it was not obvious that Savage is a something else story.
Okay. And because there's a lot of the direction, a lot of the politics, a lot of the technology that's being talked about in Savage. You can hear at various points different commentators, different people writing about what was happening at the time. As Savage goes along, I mean, you've kind of already touched on this, but as Savage goes along, do you feel it, as you say, it runs out of steam and doesn't necessarily know where it wants to go? Is it very much a kind of a cathartic strip in that it's trying to say something, and then when it says it, it said it, and that's it done?
Maybe. It started to feel somewhat like it was not so much well, it began to feel more I really don't want to be rude, but the word that I want to use is obligatory. It feels more like a strip that must continue because it is a strip. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because like I mentioned Mac 1, that did not know what it was doing at all, but I had fun most of the time. But because Bill Savage began with such a point, like he wants to get the Vogues out of Britain. And it does, it kind of just feels like they keep, well, I say they, Pat Mills. I'm sorry, Pat Mills. Just keeps thinking of a new reason to keep going. And that's thinking of a new reason to revive this war that keeps being almost won. And that is just depressing. Whether it's in real life or in fiction, like that is a depressing state to be in. Which, like I said, that's not a badly written thing. It's just a depressingly written thing. And some people do want to read that, and some people don't so much. Yeah.
You know, it's certainly Taking Liberties, which is the first collection of the Savage stuff, it put me very much in mind of that kind of the 1980s dystopias that you would get. So things like Threads.
I don't know that.
All right, I do not watch it at the moment. It is
Okay.
desperately depressing. It's basically what happens if there's in Britain if there's a nuclear war.
Oh, the thing with the guy with the bandages.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, with a real sense of occupation, not something that was hindered by Charlie Adlard's artwork on that, because you know he has such a wonderful way with blocks of black in the frame. So. Are there? Sorry, I was just trying to think what my next question should be. Because you say it, you know, it does feel as if you know the purpose of the strip changes, because so much of the first strip is haunted by the Second World War, by mythologies of Dad's army and notions of what would have happened if Hitler had invaded, which is the endless what if that seems to play in some people's heads. But then it's not really a presence in Savage in the same way. It seems that Savage seems to be being haunted by other things, things like Iraq, things like you know what's happening in America with what was happening in America with George W. Bush's presidency. So does that mean, do you think, that a character like Savage can only really be written of his time? Like whatever time he is written in, he's automatically going to reflect that point.
I don't know that I would say that, because you did compare him to Judge Dredd, and you know Dredd is forever. But I guess I think that the problem is that his like human myth divide is too liminal. Bill Savage should be dead. Like, why hasn't he died? He does too many dangerous things, and people who can teleport tigers are trying to kill him, but they haven't managed for years and years and years. I think that because the more recent stories are more down to earth, it makes the fact that he has unbelievably escaped not more unbelievable, but it makes the fact that it's a fact more I don't want to say tired again. It just seems... I don't know exactly what it seems, but it seems something. It just doesn't quite mesh, I think. I guess what I mean is there's not a big enough narrative reason for his survival. Like, it's not really metatextually explained beyond we just want to write some more Bill Savage, because he's not it's not that his status doesn't change enough, it's that it isn't consistent enough, I think. The most recent story, it doesn't really explain his position in the existing hierarchy, or he's suddenly a whole other person, and it doesn't feel natural enough to not feel perfunctory almost, or just...
Yeah. I mean, in this respect, is he more in the kind of mode of the Punisher?
I suppose again, that's hard for me to answer because I'm really not a Punisher reader. So I can only answer that in the mimetic sense, which would be a basic yes, I think. I guess the criticism that I want to make is that when he appears for a new adventure, his status is not explosively enough established. You don't get like, bam, it's Bill Savage and here he is like this doing this. It just sort of expects a sort of rollover, which does not have the tension or the excitement to make up for the loss of the humor or the immediacy of Vols just arrived and they just took over and I just want to get rid of them. There's some sort of pizzazz, I think, that for me as a reader is missing. So I wouldn't say that there's no point in bringing back Bill Savage. I just would like the return of Bill Savage to be, I guess, eventful, or like an event presented as an event, not just simply here is more from the file of Bill Savage who just simply continues to be alive. It's like he doesn't really seem to have anything to live for. He's got a sister, but they don't interact a great deal. And he's got a cause, but he doesn't really interact with that very much anymore either. And he's got a country, but most of the exploration of the social status of Britain is done through other characters, which at this point in his chronology just sidelines him. It makes him, I guess it's more of an old school type of protagonist, but I don't know if well, I mean, sometimes things
Is it
are updated because an update is better.
Is it more that later on he's much more of an abstract? He is, again, in the Dread style, he is a mirror in which we see everything else.
I would like to say yes, but I don't think that's the case. I don't understand his the purpose of Bill Savage in the very much later stories. I don't know why it's him that's there. Because the last story, Crims, I think.
He says.
Anyway, this story, he has a different name and he has a different look and he has a different identity and he has
There we go. The last one I've got is the 1,000-Year Stare.
I guess I'm talking about a different one. I don't know. I think I'm talking about one called Crims.
Right.
Yeah, he's just like effectively a different person. There is literally no reason for it to be Bill Savage, and honestly, I wasn't actually sure that it was until eventually someone said, "It's you, Bill Savage," and he was like, "No, it's not." Okay, it is then. But that just made me wonder why he is then, and the only reason was so that the one of the people he had to collaborate with, who in previous stories he would not have collaborated with because he's an organized criminal, he's a fascist essentially, he's an unpleasant person who hurts people. He hates Bill Savage, and Bill Savage is pretending to not be Bill Savage, and in the end the guy's like, "Here's why I hate Bill Savage," and Bill has to be like, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for that to happen." And it's not even something he did, really. He shot someone, and then in retaliation this guy's fiance got shot, and that isn't really enough of a story for Bill Savage at this point, or really at any point. Like, that's not enough of a story to power a story that's not about the man the story is purported to be about. It just, if we're gonna have Bill Savage, then I would like to really have some Bill Savage. I think that is I guess I just want to know more about him, not less. And as the stories continue, they seem to offer less about the man as a man, which people say that that's what works about Dredd, but I don't really think that it is. I think that is a misstated observation of something more interesting about Dredd. So putting that same framework onto this other character just turns up a less agreeable story about that character. Again, I'm not saying that these were bad comics. I had a pleasurable time reading them. I just also have these problems with them. Such is the life of a critic.
Yeah, it certainly on the point you make about Dredd, it's not so much that we don't know. It's just that the amounts of information, the amounts of emotion, the amounts of change are tiny, tiny, tiny increments, and that's what makes them so addictive.
Yeah,
because you're getting so little of it. It's not beyond the small burst at the beginning where you had, and I realise I've diverted onto talking about Dredd, but that burst at the beginning where you learn that he has a brother who was corrupt and who he is. You learn that he had a niece, and that isn't then mentioned for decades. Beyond that, the change is tiny and incremental. Whereas I do think you're right. With Bill, it's the other way. We incrementally lose him as time goes on, and the face changes don't help as well. So there's an interesting point about him being lost in this. And I wonder if that is actually intentional, that it is a comment on people who are always endlessly fighting, and that eventually they don't necessarily know who the enemy is or who they are, because every interaction, every encounter, every crisis just slices a little bit more of them away until they're, they are bare bones. They're just nothing. Whereas with Dredd, it's the other way around. He starts off being nothing, and then it slowly increases in our eyes. One of the things I did want to talk about is Howard Quartz and the integration into the Ghostbusters and therefore ABC Warriors and therefore Nemesis worlds, because Pat has always had this vision that things should, his strips should be interconnected. They should be part of a wider world. What's your feeling on that, with the introduction of the Hammerstein robots and elements of Ghostbusters? Do you think that is something that kind of pulls us away from the strip a little bit, in that we know how this is going to play out?
I was very surprised to encounter Howard Quartz and the Ghostbusters. not least because my partner and I have just read the first Ghostbusters strips in Star-Lord. So that's new to me. I mean, we've got some annuals with some like one-offs.
Yeah.
But sort of both introductions at once makes a strange sort of, because I was very surprised because I didn't think this happened yet. But of course, Howard Quartz has a man's head instead of a robot head, so I was like, okay, sure, that's when that happens. Fine. It did seem, well, it was unexpected. It was sudden. It was tonally, it was slightly strange to me because it came very soon after, or possibly intertwined with, actually, the teleporting tiger that I keep mentioning. But that's because a large cat attack is very familiar to me as a girls' comics reader, whereas robots not so much. There are not a lot of battle droids in Bunty.
I mean, that's a line for marketing this episode. Is there not a lot of battle droids in Bunty? So carry on.
So it was something to swallow. I'm not averse to it. Like it's not like I've never read a comic with a robot in it before. But I thought it was quite neat. I didn't really think that it caused any logistical problems. I would perhaps have appreciated further acknowledgement, I guess, from the characters. There are a couple of guys who are like, robots, I'm not sure about that, and then someone's like, oh, but robots are good. All right. But not a lot. Like it seemed undersold, I think, as a world change, because prior to that happening, there had been no mention of robotics in the least, and while I understand that it's part of the greater plan, I guess, of the 2000 AD story, it didn't quite seem, and this may just be because I was reading in an omnibus rather than, progs. Progs? I'm not saying it that way. It didn't seem as bedded in, I guess, as I would expect. Because like various weird stuff is introduced in the first couple of years of 2000 AD, and every time it's something new because it's just being invented. But it's nicely woven between the various strips. You get a little bit here that links up with a little bit here and a little bit here. So it all kind of seems like everything's traveling along together, even though they're traveling at different points in time. But reading these out of context, I suppose, it was rather, well, unexpected. I just keep saying unexpected. It was. I didn't really, like, as I read on, it didn't really bother me. Like, it didn't grind the gears or anything. It just has a sort of isolated impact, I suppose. It's just suddenly robots.
Well, I guess it's, from my point of view, it's kind of part of the escalation of technology throughout the strip. I'm talking Savage, not Invasion and not Disaster 1990. It's, to a certain extent, it's kind of like reading a Robert Fisk book, in that there's like a steady awareness of changing technology and increased use of technology by the military-industrial complex, which ultimately is the baddie in all of this. And there's a very much a kind of overarching conspiracy that all conflicts are invented by the people who get to sell the bombs.
Yeah.
So I see it from that point, but it's also something, you're entirely right. As somebody who's coming to it relatively without the huge back knowledge of somebody who's been reading 2000 AD for a long time, especially not the knowledge of somebody who had read it since the very beginning, that kind of beat isn't necessarily going to land in the same way if you're only just encountering this.
It's not that it seems like unrealistic, I guess, because, as you say, various technological developments and weird gases and strange things on the ground, things that don't exist, speculative inventions, have been present throughout. It just it's robots. Really, as a general reader, I think many people who do not expect robots will be perturbed when robots are not the point of the story, when they suddenly appear. I think I apologize for having so many criticisms. I think that I would be more at home with why didn't he meet one? You said that
shoot him, surely.
Are you a writer of fiction or not? Because Rogers and Hammerstein have such a class consciousness to their atoms that Bill Savage meeting some Hammersteins and not having a chat is very strange to me. Maybe he does. You mentioned a later story that it seemed like I maybe missed or something, so maybe eventually he does, but in the several, I presume, strips, in the stuff that I read, no contact. It's just there are now robots running around, sometimes murdering people in hospitals, sometimes being soldiers, and that's just part of the background whilst whatever else is going on. It's a little bit distracting, I suppose. Not, again, unreadably or disagreeably so. It's just hard to put together like an idea of what the strip is. It would be hard for me to summarize what it's like reading Savage, or what Savage is as a book. Like, if someone asks me which of these omnibuses on the shelf should I get Savage, what's it about, I would be like, bunch of stuff. It's pretty good, but I don't know what I can tell you beyond things happen in it. It's tricky.
That kind of the build of technology and the introduction of technology, particularly lethal technology, really reminded me of the early stories of Finn, which was another Pat Mills story within the 90s, where there is an introduction of new technological elements, and then they're shown to be being used by the hero. You don't necessarily learn an awful lot about the hero. So again, the hero is in abstract, as it were. He's anti-hero is in abstract, while the forces around him, he's the deliverer of violence and vengeance or revenge or whatever. So it's and there's the anti-corporatism of Savage I see paralleled in Finn as well, even though that's more Cthulhu-esque, kind of alien deep sea monsters. So yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because it's a strip that the vast majority of the story of Bill Savage is Savage, in a certain amount of time. Disaster 1919 existed for a certain amount of time. Just kind of thinking about kind of concluding remarks. I mean, you've said, reading this, you had a good time. It was enjoyable comics. Looking back on the whole of it, how do you feel about that body of work and what it says to a reader who isn't necessarily, a Dreadhead or a 2000 AD fan?
It's a war comic. It's a man comic. It's a weird comic. It's definitely, I think, a European comic, which I mean, it's definitely from the British comics historical legacy. It's right there. This is what we do, but Britain is a part of Europe for now, and the European storytelling styles share a lot of common ground with Savage, even as it also shares nothing. Like, there are a lot of French market comics about the one guy with the cool skills and the firearms and the secrets, and he can travel and he can get things done and so on. You can read a lot of those in translation today. A lot of them are good comics, but most of them, probably all of them, do not have a teleporting tiger. And they also don't have the elements of Britishness that are recognizable and evident. He's a bit like the Punisher, but he's really not like the Punisher. He's just, this is British comics, I guess. Like, the fact that it is kind of aggressively patriotic at times is uncomfortable, but that is our nature. And it's not uncritical, and it's not perfect. It's a reflection, like you say.
It is noticeable in the original Invasion that certainly the so many of the story titles, and some of which are chosen retrospectively, but reflect the setting of each story. It's almost like a weird Pevsner's guide to England. One minute you're at one tourist destination, another minute you're at another. So I agree. He is a fundamentally British character. He wouldn't work in any other setting, I don't think. And I think what Mills has been trying to do is throughout, both in Invasion and the early Invasion stories and into Savage, is trying to say something about his view of Britain, of its people, and of its politics, and it's class as well. The question of class. So it is, in a way, by definition, a story about class warfare.
Yeah, I think the fact that well, Pat Mills is Irish. Jesus, what's his surname? Blasco. Blasco is Spanish. It's a British comic. Is told or made by observers, by people who would face a certain amount of barrier when presented with, well, you know, just a fucking racist. So someone who would call themselves a patriot would quite possibly question these people's ability to define Britain, and yet they have. That's who we are. That's how it works. So it's a relic, like it's an argument in some senses, I suppose, but it's also just like good reading.
Really fascinating perspective from Claire on that. Hope you enjoyed that deep dive. I want to do more again in the future, so keep the suggestions rolling in. thrillcast@2000ad.com. We're going to be having more chats in coming episodes, including deep dives, more interviews, more panel-esque talks. So yeah, if you've got a suggestion of what you want to see, then do let us know. I'm currently trying to twist Tin and Trevelyan's arm to come on the podcast, and I've decided to take it public because he's very reluctant to do so. Because I want to talk about Fiends of the Eastern Front, which is a series that we've had Ian Edgington on the last time there was a series, and the new one's looking really fun and perfect Halloween reading. So yeah, I really want Tin and come on the podcast. Come on, you know you want to. I'm gonna leave that there, and we should be back in a week's time. So hope to see you then. Stay safe, take care of one another, and wrap it warm. And splendid Beth Fig. Take care, athletes.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.